Greetings of the day. Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hey.
Hello. We are continuing our series on the impossibility of a new home, novels about immigrants trying to make a life for themselves in a new place. We are talking about W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz. If this is your first time listening to us, you can find our book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod. That link is in the episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. And if you want to support us in your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That link is also in the episode description. In this episode, we will be revealing spoilers, but as we discussed last week, really there aren't that many spoilers. So, I think even if you care about that, you can just go ahead and listen. Next week, we'll be continuing our series with The Buddha in the Attic by Julie Otsuka. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. This is the second novel that we've read recently where the writer includes photographs as part of the narrative. The first was Mumbo Jumbo. That episode was published a few months ago as part of our Afrofuturism series. Do you think that these photographs in these two novels have the same effect on you as the reader?
No, not at all. Mumbo Jumbo seemed just general texture, that it didn't necessarily have to do with what was being discussed in the novel. There were a couple things that did link directly, but largely it was just flavor. Here, it's much more direct. It's much more connected to what is happening in the surrounding text. As you mentioned, James, in the last episode, getting the image of a fortress and how it looks like a crab, things like that, it is much more contextual and much more helpful, I guess, in understanding what is being discussed.
I'm not sure I agree with you. I think that in one way, they work in the same way as in Mumbo Jumbo. The photographs in both novels are there to present a kind of sense of veracity. Whenever you have a photograph, especially accompanying text, it's to show, this is not invention. This is how it really is. It's taking the writer out of the equation a little bit. I think it works in Mumbo Jumbo to different effect only because there Ishmael Reed is trying to say, this is real history. This is an academic monograph that you're reading. In this novel, I think that Sebald plays with that a little bit more because, yes, they are real photos and they do have the air of veracity, but at the same point, they're not really photos of what he's describing. Like the photo of the boy on the cover of the book is not really Jock Austerlitz because Jock Austerlitz doesn't exist. So the reader who's looking at these photos will know at one point, yes, it has the appearance of a real thing, but obviously it can't be the real thing. Another thing I think is that when we see images of the Holocaust, especially, we are used to sensationalized images. And I think in this novel, the images are not sensational at all. They're very flat. You'll see a picture of a building. You'll see a picture of a person's face. You'll see a picture of a rugby team. It's never piles of dead bodies. It's never people being murdered necessarily. So I think it changes the way images of the Holocaust are presented in a very unique way.
So, yeah, you mentioned that, these photos are not actually real in the way that he's portraying it to us. Why do you think he's doing it then? Why have that question of whether or not this is real?
I think it's important in the sense that even if these particular images are not really depicting the things that we hear about in this novel, they could be real because this is a story that's not real, but it could be real. And, the Jock Austerlitz that we meet on these pages doesn't exist, but in the world, there probably is somebody very similar to Jock Austerlitz. And there are stories, numerous untold stories that we don't get access to. And in one respect, Jacques Austerlitz gives us access to those stories. So it's important, I think, for Sebald's project to let us understand that these are real lives and real people, even if the images don't actually correspond to the characters.
I think one similarity for me is that both of these books deal with history, and my initial thought was that by presenting these photos, the writer is presenting artifacts of a sort, like that you would see in a history museum. But, in the context of what you just said, Ed, it seems like it's almost as if the two writers, Ishmael Reed in Mumbo Jumbo and Sebald in Austerlitz, it's as if they have different purposes almost. Because in Mumbo Jumbo, we did discuss this, but it seems like Reed wants to establish some semblance of a true history. Like, I think he's putting the photos in here to say this is real. Whereas in Austerlitz, we know it's real, except for the Holocaust deniers, I guess. But we know it's real. But these photos, because they are not actually the actual photos, there are questions about the veracity and the origin. Like I read in one of the Guardian reviews that they said that photo was a picture of Sebald when he was young, but it turns out that's not true. So that's the thing that really sticks out to me is like, why have that? And I think, you did answer it, but it's still a question I have in my mind. Like, what is the purpose of this photo? Why have it be such that you end up questioning, what is the origin of this?
I think it satisfies the reader's desire for documentation, but at the same time, it tells the reader that this desire that you have is illegitimate because no real documentation is possible in this case. In the novel, there's a picture of a woman, and the picture is meant to be Austerlitz's mother. But actually, I've found the video that the novel lifts this from, and it is a picture of a woman in Theresienstadt, and she was a Jewish prisoner, but obviously she's not Austerlitz's mother because Austerlitz doesn't exist. So it's a blending of something that's undeniably real with something that's undeniably false. And in order to get at that feeling that we want as readers for the truth, sometimes the best way that we can get at that is by being deliberately false. And I think that's what Sebald is getting at.
So for me, my experience with photos in fiction is actually very limited to like kids' books. Like if you read a very old copy of The Secret Garden, every once in a while, they'll illustrate a photo for you as a child because I guess they assume that children have no imagination and can't visualize what a garden looks like. But obviously, it's used very differently here and in Mumbo Jumbo. So, what do you think about the use of photographs in fiction? Obviously, it's used in very particular ways, but do you like it? Do you like photographs in fiction interrupting the narrative flow?
For me, generally, no, but I actually did like it here. It was distracting in Mumbo Jumbo, actually, for me. But here it felt in the way that Yed is discussing, even if these aren't necessarily true photos of what is being discussed, that it could be. It gave it the air of veracity. I didn't take it as a non-fictional thing, but more as here's an example of what this might look like.
I think that photos in fiction are fine. I don't have a problem with them, but I think that it's this kind of paraliterary technique that requires a degree of artistry that maybe other writers don't have. You have to be thoughtful with whatever you do, and doing more things requires more thought. And I think that to Sebald's credit, it works very well here because they are very thoughtfully employed. And perhaps to Ishmael Reed's downfall, as we mentioned when we're talking about Mumbo Jumbo, the photos seem kind of tacked on. They don't seem as integral or as interesting. So it's just a technique that carries its own risks. And I think here it's done very well. I mean, we have read, probably all of us, Kurt Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions, and that novel famously has Kurt Vonnegut's drawings, I think, of an asshole at one point. Like, there are these very crude and funny drawings, but it's kind of a similar thing, right? Like, illustrated novels are usually meant for children. So when a novel meant for adults includes illustrations of any kind, there is the sense it needs to be justified. Why are they there? And I think that a playful writer can do it with illustrations, and a thoughtful writer can do it with photos, but it has to be deliberate. It can't just be like, oh, well, this person's probably want to know what this looks like, so I'm just going to show them a photo. Like, that's not enough.
Well, it helps build mood as well. Like here, there was a gloominess that I think the photos helped with. The books that jumped to mind when we're discussing this, definitely Breakfast of Champions, but also I feel like a lot of especially moody books, such as collections of Poe short stories, things of that gothic nature tend to have these really moody drawings that obviously the text doesn't need, but it helps create that mood. Or this is definitely a children's book, but Alice in Wonderland almost always seems to have drawings, and they're usually really interesting.
It's kind of interesting because convention has changed. I have a very old copy of Hawthorne. Was it the House of whatever number of Gables? Don't
7.
remember. There are more than 5 Gables. But that book has illustrations of the Gables. And I know old copies of Sherlock Holmes and Dickens, they have illustrations as well.
Right.
It's just interesting, like how convention has changed in this regard, where 200 years ago, it was kind of expected that you would have a novel with these pictures. I haven't given much thought to it, but I'm guessing it's because the way of writing back then was not very image driven. So maybe publishers felt like they had to illustrate something for the reader.
Well, and the novel was still fairly young back then too, right? Consider Dickens. Dickens was serialized, right? So if you picture that coming out in segments, maybe that sold magazines.
Or maybe, if you're like chapter 6 into the novel and serialized, the description of the characters were like in chapter 2, so you don't know what they look like.
Right.
Another thing I think that's important for Austerlitz specifically is that the character Jacques Austerlitz is attracted to these images and has these images specifically as photographic images. So it's not really illustration in the typical sense of the author showing you what something looks like, because Austerlitz carries these things with him and loves them as photographs rather than for what they are representing, just as images. They matter to him.
Right.
So I think it's reasonable to depict those very same images in the book because it's not trying to hide the fact that a photograph of something is not the same as what it represents.
Yeah, and this is something I mentioned in last week's episode, but what I really did like about Sebald's work here is he doesn't give us neat and tidy answers to the whys and to the images. That's what I talked about last week. Like, I think the reason for photographs here are multifaceted. I think there are different ways you can look at why he's doing it. Like, one is what you just mentioned. Yeah, that Austerlitz is someone who likes to collect them. But another way of looking at it is it's, as I mentioned before, like artifacts in a museum. But you can also look at it as, I think there's a part in the book where Austerlitz tells the narrator, like, you can go to my home and look at them. He tells them, like, you can go there and like get these things. So it's something that kind of gets passed on, and it's like a mode of transmission. You can think about its purpose in the book in a lot of different ways, and they all kind of work because of the way he's set up the novel. Like, there's no one way to understand it, I think.
On a different note, I read an essay by Sebald that I think can help us understand this novel a little bit more. In the essay on the natural history of destruction, Sebald writes, "There was a tacit agreement equally binding on everyone that the true state of material and moral ruin in which the country found itself was not to be described. The darkest aspects of the final act of destruction, as experienced by the great majority of the German population, remained under a kind of taboo, like a shameful family secret, a secret that perhaps could not even be privately acknowledged." I think that is very resonant with the ideas that we find in this novel. In Austerlitz, I think Sebald's primary concern seems to be with how trauma in the past can continue to traumatize us. Yet, differently, Jacques Austerlitz's situation seems to be less about a refusal to acknowledge the past and more about an inability to repress the past. So, do you think that this novel suggests anything about how not only individuals like Jacques Austerlitz, but societies like post war Germany can move forward from trauma? Is this something that people can deal with, or is the ongoing presence of the past an inescapable human misery?
Well, leaving aside the second part of your question, I don't think the novel suggests anything. I don't think he's making a positive statement in the novel.
By suggest, I don't mean that he is promoting anything, but I think that there is something that could be read as a hint or a gesture towards something. Perhaps not explicitly a gesture, but perhaps something that sets the reader up to do some of his own thinking and feeling about this.
One of the images that popped into my mind over and over in this book is how Austerlitz always appears with his rucksack. He's always moving, he's always traveling. And then later, toward the end of the book, when we see where he's living, he doesn't have a whole lot of belongings. It's very stripped down. There's, like a couple crates or something. It feels like a simplified life devoid of things, which suggests to me an understanding of impermanence, but also that Austerlitz is he's still figuring himself out. He's still got this unsteady mind that's working at unraveling or rebuilding itself and isn't content to settle. Or as you put it, there's an inability to repress the past, but also that he's still, even now, understanding his past, it's still not fully formed in him. It's hard to construct a self when that self has been under lock and key for so long. So I think at the end of the novel, I don't know that if he's still lost, but he's also not found completely either. So I feel like there's this kind of limbo between the two states that you're talking about. It's like you have to move forward, but at the same time, moving forward with this inescapable trauma.
I want to take that a bit, Sam, and run with it. So, if we're looking at the end of the novel, is there a tonal shift for you? Because for me, what happens is you have Austerlitz. Austerlitz is telling the narrator he has decided to go to, I think, is it the Pyrenees? To this camp outside of Paris, right? So he's continuing his journey. But the book doesn't end there. It continues with the narrator returning to, I forget what that place is called. One of the other, it's another prison camp, right? So the book actually does not end with Austerlitz telling him, here I am, going to resolve my issues and looking for my father, right? It ends with the narrator going back to a place he had been previously. So for me, I actually did not read any tonal shifts in the novel. I see it as a returning.
I think that, if you're looking for a shift, you're looking for a shift perhaps in the wrong place, because post, nervous breakdown, Austerlitz may not have shifted at the end, but I think the mental breakdown that occurs in the middle of the novel is significant. And he has shifted past that. And I think that is perhaps, I don't even want to use the word advocate, but that is what Sebald is gesturing towards, is that when we try to suppress things or ignore things, it is an unsuccessful strategy. I don't think that he's saying that at the end of the novel, Austerlitz is going to be happy and cheerful and totally at peace with himself. But I think at the end of the novel, he is at least better than he was when he had his nervous breakdown.
I read the ending of the novel as he's relating the story of Heschel's kingdom, which is quite interesting. And it is positive, but it's not positive tonally in the way that I think we would expect, because what happens is this older Jewish Lithuanian man dies, and the family of that person moves to South Africa, and as a result escapes the horrors of the Holocaust. And then one of the descendants ends up going back to Lithuania and finds that there's nothing Jewish left. Like, that's how I read the ending, which for me is quite bleak. It's a complete like removal of Jewish history from Lithuania. And there's a wonderful image. I love the images in the book, right? Of this guy looking into a diamond mine, I think. He writes that it was truly terrifying to see such emptiness open up a foot away from firm ground, to realize that there was no transition, only this dividing line, with ordinary life on one side and its unimaginable opposite on the other. Like, yeah, this is looking into the void. It's also looking into the horrors of the Holocaust, of life and death. Like, for me, I see what you're saying, Ed, in that, he is in a way saying you have to look at what has happened. But I don't see it as any kind of tonal shift. I don't see Sebald saying, hey, I'm pointing to this, really pay attention to this, which is something you should take away from this novel. Because then Jacobson, the character in Heschel's Kingdom, the book that the narrator's reading, he goes into how he goes to Lithuania, he finds scarcely any trace of his forebears, only signs everywhere of the annihilation from which Heschel's weak heart had preserved his immediate family when it stopped beating. Like, it's once again this kind of irony that is present in this book, where he died so that his family could live, but his family lived by escaping, Lithuania, and then everyone else died. For me, I don't see it as very different from the rest of the book. I don't see any kind of even a real suggestion that by the end of the book, this is what I'm supposed to take from it. Like, it's still striking the same note for me.
I think what the book advocates is acknowledgement. It doesn't say that acknowledgement will resolve sadness. It doesn't say that acknowledgement will resolve trauma, because the trauma is built into the foundation of post-war European society. There is that scene near the end of the novel where he goes to the National Library of France, which has moved to a new location, and the librarian tells him that the basement of the library had been used as a warehouse to store stolen goods that had been stolen from the Jews of Paris. So everywhere you look in Europe, you find these memories and this material culture that reminds you of this great injustice, but hiding from it and pretending that it didn't happen is untenable, because whether or not you acknowledge the past, it's omnipresent in every moment. And I think that omnipresence is very important. And that's, I think, what he's pointing to both in this novel and also in that passage that I read from his essay about post-war German society, is that hiding or pretending that something doesn't exist cannot serve you indefinitely. It can serve you for a period of time, but at some point there will be a reckoning.
Yeah, I think in terms of, if you look at this book in its entirety, it is very much about acknowledging and looking at what's remaining.
Most of the descriptions seem to be about places. James, you, in the last episode, you described them to bones of an animal, which feel very apt to me. It's the remains of something that was great, and now there are nothing but ghosts in so many places. There is even a part where he talks about that. He even describes that ghetto as being full of what seem like ghosts or people on another plane going about their existence as if they never left. But it's a very ghostly feel.
I think one of the most directly moving parts of this novel, that most directly shows us the casualties of this kind of refusal to acknowledge his past, is Austerlitz's relationship with his lover, Marie de Verneuil. Because in the middle of the novel, they take a trip together to Marienbad, which actually young Austerlitz visited as a child, but he doesn't realize it at the time. And their relationship breaks down because she keeps saying to him basically, "What's wrong with you? Why are you so withdrawn? Why can't you show yourself to me?" And he doesn't realize in the setting like why he's so troubled and why this is causing such difficulty for him. And very soon after that trip they end up separating. So that to me, I think, was a particularly moving and more directly moving scene than other parts of the novel. It really shows you how much this type of trauma can continue to affect people.
So, to circle back a bit, then, Ed, did you read this book as someone actually moving forward? I think that's the difference in our readings. Is I agree with everything you said, except I don't see it as a way for individuals or societies to move forward. I don't see the movement part. I see it as him presenting the importance of looking at history. So did you feel like there was in this novel that movement where Austerlitz did in fact move forward and that this is prescriptive?
It's not prescriptive, but I think if you have the choice between harm and less harm, I think what we can see in the novel is that a refusal to acknowledge the past or an attempt to repress the past will cause harm. I think that's quite clear. At least, when we look at what's happened to Austerlitz, we can say that he is better for acknowledging and investigating his past than he was otherwise. I mean, do you not see that? Do you think that this is something that's impossible to deal with and that we don't know anything from this novel about how trauma can be dealt with?
Yeah, I don't see Sebald taking that on in the novel. I don't see it as a purpose of the novel.
Purpose, I think, is not the word that I would use. I think that as a reader, I come to this. I don't know if that's what Sebald wants me to arrive at as a conclusion or as a lesson. I just think that it's shown to me. He presents a situation, he presents a character, and when I look at the situation and when I look at the character, that's the way I feel about it.
Yeah, the way I approach it is I see everything that you're describing, but for me, it's presented to us as if it's the way it is, that there is no movement forward or backward, because that signifies some kind of movement of time. Like, there seems to be a lot here about time kind of rushing around us, but at the same time, things are static. And it seems that that is what's presented to me, and that's what I take from this book, is that these things are static. Like you talked earlier about how maybe this is like inescapable. And I actually think yes. Like inescapable kind of has a negative connotation, so maybe I wouldn't go with inescapable, but I would say that it is omnipresent. Like you look at it, you look at the trauma, and it's here. That's what it is about. It's not so much about like you look at it and then you can move forward. It's more like let's look at it.
I think that that inescapability is not a given. I think that the fact that this is the way that it is something that you have to understand about life. It's not obvious immediately. And I think in general that this points to a difficulty that people have with the idea of learning from art. When we talk about learning from art, people often reject the idea because they think, well, it's not didactic. It's not meant to teach you a lesson. And we're so used to bad art that tries to teach you a lesson that we think that it's impossible for good art to do it. But what I think this is it's good art that can show you something about life, but it shows you only by showing you something about life that you didn't realize previously. And then when you see that, that helps you live your life in a different way.
Right. It's not, as you said, prescriptive. It's more presenting a way of thinking about things. This is actually a really natural transition to one of the things I wanted to talk about, which is that two of the biggest conceits or focuses of the novel for me were that of time and memory. They're often discussed together and they're inextricably linked. But I think that the way they're discussed is a little bit different. Early in the book, Austerlitz talks about how he has cut himself off from time to the extent that he has never owned any sort of clock or watch. Time seems almost meaningless to him. In fact, at one point, I think he talks about closing out a bar.
He's at the Grand Eastern Hotel, I think, and they drink so late that the bartender is waiting for them.
That's right. Yeah, is waiting to close up behind them. So time is almost meaningless to him, and the narration often mirrors this. Like the narrator wanders around old forts and castles and talks about how the wars that have been fought there to little end in the long run, that the walls continue to stand even long past their use and their occupants' reign. Austerlitz even goes as far as to call time a silly human invention, even though it is this everlasting thing stretching from everyone's beginning to end. On the other hand, memory is a much more hazy concept. So in the same breath that he talks about never owning a watch, he goes on to say that he believes all moments of time have coexisted simultaneously. And to interject here, this goes back to what we were just talking about. All moments of time have coexisted simultaneously, in which case none of what history tells us would be true. Past events have not yet occurred, but are waiting to do so at the moment when we think of them. Although that, of course, opens up the bleak prospect of everlasting misery and never-ending anguish. So we get that before we even dive into Austerlitz's past. At this point, all of that is still unknown to us. He is still examining time, but while time itself exists as this monolithic force, I think the memories he discusses are much more wispy or fragmentary things that somehow exist all at once, or as we discover later, are buried and in this state of limbo until they're unearthed. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, he even senses Prague's Jews as he wanders around Terezin as having never left, that they're still going about their days as these sort of fleeting other dimensionary beings. So I think there's this tension between time and memory. One is this human invention, and one exists in the mind and all over the buildings and land in Europe. So how do these things connect with each other, or how do they pull at each other?
The part of the book that I actually didn't really like that much is when he said that, what did you say, that he never owned any kind of clock, that time is meaningless to him. And I understand that it is, in a way, giving us Austerlitz, the character. But I honestly just did not like that. That seems to be a foolish way to live one's life. Like, I'm not talking about practicalities. I'm talking about what he's trying to present to us here. That you have a person who's not living in the time, like a time stream that everyone else is, that he is stuck in the past, so he cannot move forward. Like, it's a little bit too on the nose to say he's never owned any sort of clock. For me, it's a lack of subtlety, whereas the rest of the book, I actually really appreciated how subtle he was. So I actually did not like that one passage in the book. Is that how you're reading it, Sam? That when he's saying that he has never owned any sort of clock, it's because he's focused on the past, like he can't move forward.
Yeah, it felt like he is still experiencing the trauma, and it did feel, I will say, it did feel when I went over that passage that there was like a bell ringing, that I went, this is going to be important.
That's not how I read it. It's interesting because I didn't think it was like he was stuck in the past, but rather it was a way of him saying that he saw time as not this linear thing, but rather as a consistent moment where past, present, and future exist at the same time. And I do agree with you, James, though, that I thought it was a bit heavy-handed. It was almost kind of like this affectation of somebody telling, oh, I don't own a TV or whatever. It's like, you don't have to be that guy. But I do think that the idea of time is important to the novel, and that was just, I guess, Sebald's way of pointing towards its importance. I do think that the presence of the past in the present moment is quite conspicuous throughout the novel, if only just for its narration. We have this reported speech. We have something happening, which sometimes is reported to Austerlitz, and then Austerlitz reports it to the narrator, and the narrator narrates it. So you have several layers of events happening simultaneously in the narrator's reported speech. And that shows you how things are kind of compressed into a moment. But you also have this kind of Proustian involuntary memory where just by hearing something, instantly Austerlitz is clued into something else, like the scene in the bookshop where he listens to the radio and he just hears the word Prague, and then he knows, oh, I have to go to Prague, and things like that, where the past is inescapable in the present moment. Even though we're not looking for it, it's always there.
There's this compressed feeling that you mentioned really early on when the narrator is walking around, I think it's called Breendonk, and he's talking about how long it would have taken to build each new part of the structure, and that by the time they finish whatever that part is, it's already obsolete, that there are already machines of war that have been created to overcome whatever obstacle that is. I feel like the whole book is discussing time collapse like that, where things exist on top of each other. It's like they're waiting to be discovered, but at the same time, no discovery is really needed. It's all there. The history is, as one of you put it, written all over Europe. It's all over everywhere the characters go.
So this goes to, once again, what I really love about this book, because what you just described about Breendonk is one totally valid way of understanding that part of the book. And I think another way is, I believe this was a fort that grew and grew and grew, and then eventually was repurposed to be a concentration camp, right? And he gives us actually, I think, 2 other examples of this. At the very end, it's another fort that was repurposed into a concentration camp. So that's actually really interesting, because it gives you this thought, this idea of repurposing, where something that's supposed to protect you ends up being a place that kills you. And he does it with this one image. So this is, I know, a tangent to what you're talking about, but it's really what I love about the novel, is that he's able to have all these different things compressed in one image.
It feels like there's a lot of that kind of thing, because when he's talking about Germany, when Austerlitz talks about how, despite having read all these things and studied all these things, just about every culture in Europe, he had unconsciously avoided anything having to do with Germany. And he didn't have any real reason for it, or at least so he thought. But we, as the reader, understand later that it's this trauma that has been built up from his past, from his family, that he didn't understand until much later in his life. One of the other things that comes through that deals with these concepts of time and memory is place. I think the way that Sebald treats place is very different from the way place is treated in most books. How does that come into the equation for you guys?
I think that place is used in 2 ways. I think it's used as a trigger for these involuntary memories, just in the same way that the radio broadcast that I mentioned triggers his memories of Prague. When he actually goes to Prague and he is in that country, in the Czech Republic, no, not the first time, but when he goes to visit his old nanny, just being in that place that had been so familiar to him at the beginning of his life seems to even bring back his ability to speak Czech to some degree. So it's like everything that has happened in a person's life can be brought back. It's existing somehow simultaneously inside of us, just waiting for the right trigger, and the trigger can be a place. I think the second thing that I want to say is that when we have that scene that I had mentioned before about the library, about how the library had been previously used as a storehouse for Nazi loot, I think it's just another way of showing that the past is written everywhere, in every place. If you decide to look for it, or if you just decide to acknowledge it, even rather than to look for it, you will see it everywhere. And it's not just in the library, but everywhere he goes, you see these reminders of this great injustice that has happened in the past.
I feel like there's also this duality of like a permanence, that all these structures, all these cities are still standing. They've been here for so long. And yet there's also this transitory feel to a lot of the novel, that places shift and move, and it moves along with Austerlitz. There's the way he meanders through these places. I don't really know how to even break it down, really, because I didn't take any notes on this particular aspect. But places don't feel as solid or as immobile in this book as most novels treat places. Everything seems very flowing between each other. One place moves right into the next, just as he moves from place to place.
I felt differently, actually, because he does move a lot. And I think that it does create that sense that for him, in some way, any place is as good as the next. Like, he doesn't seem very fixed in London. He's lived there for a long time. He lived in Paris for a long time. He's more mobile, I think, than most readers. And I also think that he is less attached to the world around him than most people are. So he does seem less fixed in one place. But I think it's much more specific that he's traveling rather than that the places are somehow unfixed, because I think that the places are quite substantial. I think, like when he travels in the middle of the novel and he goes to Liverpool Street Station in London, and just being there in that place brings back all of these feelings and images from the past when he arrived there in 1939. That seemed quite interesting to me. Like, why is this one particular place so significant to him, maybe 70 years later?
I guess it's not so much the place that's changing, it's the memories, it's the time that we've already discussed a bit. How maybe the place itself has not moved or anything, but those memories exist on top of each other, or as James put it, these places have been repurposed over and over again, just as they're being repurposed in his life. Like him going through Liverpool Station as an adult is much different from when he was there as a child.
Maybe you could say that the changes that occur are superficial, but the essence of the past is somehow contained in these places, even if superficially they change purpose or the buildings are reconstructed or reused in a different way.
All right, let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about children and migration. Welcome back. So we usually think of adult immigrants, but in this book, Austerlitz focuses on emigration as a child. Children are often unaware of what's happening and uninvolved in the decision to emigrate. So what does this book add to the conversation about immigration?
What I think is interesting about this book is that it does deal with a child's emigration, but we don't see most of that. It still comes to us as he's an adult. I think what's bigger is that the trauma that existed since he was a child, the trauma that continues, that he's still working through, over 50 years later.
So this overlaps, but I think it doesn't really focus on immigration as much as it focuses on being a refugee. Like for me, this is much more about being a refugee and less about the typical trials and tribulations you face as someone who immigrates to another place. And obviously, the Venn diagram has a lot of overlap here, but because of what we talked about with trauma, the pull of the past, like it really is about how, as a refugee, you lose something forcefully, not by choice. And when you try to get that back, you may not get back exactly what you are looking for, or maybe what you are looking for was never there. It's a kind of a different set of questions and concerns.
I think even for non-refugee children who immigrate to another country, they often do end up losing something, and it's not their choice. It's often their parents' choice or something to do with just the society that they were born into. And I think what this novel can show us about that kind of situation is that some part of them will always be connected to another place. Whether or not they realize it or acknowledge it, there will be some difference that marks them. And I think that is a very difficult thing for a young child to deal with. And I think that often they don't deal with it because they don't know how to deal with it. And I think a lot of adults also don't know how to deal with it, but it's especially difficult for children.
The whole book is talking about things that he's lost, where he's talking about being in that station. He suddenly remembers, I think he calls him a brother that he lost. I got the sense that it wasn't actually his brother, but a person he befriended, either on the kinder transport or at that station. Someone that he kind of huddled with and then quickly lost thereafter. Goes along with this, even if he's connected to this place, he was separated as soon as he got to the UK. He was disconnected from his Czech past and his Czech people, and his Jewish people.
So one thing that seems to be conspicuously absent in our discussion is we haven't talked about Wales at all and about his adoptive family. This series is about the impossibility of a new home, and it's pretty clearly established for us at the beginning that he doesn't belong in his new home. And I think it's fairly clear to us the reason why he doesn't belong is because he's got this hidden history that he doesn't know about. Like, that is the focus of the episode, not Wales and not his adoptive parents and where he's going to school. So, do you think this book neatly fits into our series? The impossibility of fitting into a new home or of belonging to a new place?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know what Wales particularly would have to do with it. I think that what makes it fit into the series is the fact that even when he doesn't realize where he comes from, he's ill at ease wherever he is. And there is this kind of subconscious trauma that exists from being moved from one place to another that makes feeling at home anywhere impossible.
Yeah, the key word in our series for me with this book is impossibility. It's not so much that he's fitting into a new home, because he's always on the go. He's always traveling and searching, even before he knows what he's searching for. But that unsettling feeling he has permeates the whole book, that impossibility of fitting in.
So this is something that actually harkens back to what I said just previously. I don't think the fact that he's in a new place matters at all. I think what matters is the fact that he's lost his parents and he's a refugee. Like, what if instead this book were him being raised by Vera, his nanny, and Vera just told him, you're actually my child, to protect him. And he doesn't know until he's grown up, and he's lived in the same place just a door down the hallway from where his parents were. Would the story be very different? I actually would say no. Like, the story is not about that. It's not about him being in a new country, really. It's about him losing his past.
I would say it would be different.
Yeah, I think part of it is the culture. Not so much that he talks at length about Welsh or British culture, but that a key piece of him that's missing is not knowing even where he came from. Not just that he doesn't have his parents, but not knowing the place at all. What you would get from being raised as the next door neighbor, you could still explore the ideas of the Jewish ghetto, about coming late to that, but it wouldn't be as big of a removal. There's something about being on the Kindertransport all alone and arriving in a place that is so far removed from where you started and not even being aware of that.
Well, it ends on Sam, so that's never a good sign.
Thanks.
Let's stop here. Thank you for listening. Next week, we will review the final book in this series, The Buddha in the Attic by Julie Otsuka. We've also got an updated reading list you can find on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where we post threads for our book club discussion every Friday. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you enjoy this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. When you give that review, you can also let us know what kind of books or series or authors you'd like us to read. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.